I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
The moon is a place of terror. It is ugly, harsh, and nothing like the pictures we were shown. For years we were told it was majestic and inspiring, but Apollo astronaut Charles Duke says that was never the truth. Before he dies, the youngest man to walk there has revealed what he really saw, and it has left scientists terrified. The voice that guided Armstrong and the invisible astronaut. At 89 years old, Charles Duke is one of only 4 men still alive who walked on the moon. He is also the youngest of the 12 men who ever left footprints on its surface.
Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
This fact alone gives his words an extraordinary weight today. He knows that his time is short and that his voice will not be around forever. That is why his recent decision to speak openly about what he really experienced matters so much. These are not casual recollections. They are the last urgent words of a man who lived inside the most dangerous and secretive chapter of human exploration.
Well, I was so excited, though I couldn't even pronounce tranquility. It came out twang. Roger twang, I corrected myself.
Duke's story began long before he set foot on the moon. In July 1969, the world watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin make history with the Apollo 11 mission. This was the first time humans had ever attempted to land on the lunar surface. The mission carried enormous risk, and every step had to be carefully coordinated between the astronauts in space and the controllers on Earth. What most people do not realize is that Duke was the person who spoke to them from Mission Control in Houston. His role was called CAPCOM, short for Capsule Communicator. NASA always assigned another astronaut to be the single voice between the crew and the ground team, so that instructions would never be confused.
Company fighter. Roger. Time to open up the LRL doors, Charlie. Roger, we got you coming home.
On that day, with billions of people watching around the world, Charles Duke was the man whose calm voice guided Armstrong and Aldrin through the most critical moments of the landing.
320, bearing 350, and range is 4.3.
As the lunar module was descending against repeated computer alarms, dangerously low fuel, and the pressure of choosing a safe landing site before time ran out, every instruction and every clearance passed through Duke's headset. Inside Mission Control, the atmosphere was suffocating. The engineers and controllers sat frozen, watching the fuel tick down second by second. They knew that if Armstrong did not find a safe spot to land within the next half minute, the entire mission could end in disaster. When Armstrong finally called back, "The Eagle has landed," the room erupted in relief. Duke was the one who responded. His words were, "Roger, tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." For anyone unfamiliar with NASA's radio language, this was a mix of formal confirmation and human honesty. "Roger, tranquility. We copy you on the ground," meant Mission Control had clearly received Armstrong's transmission.
Even though Mission Control, by picking up moon rocks and setting up experiments, there was still enough time to take advantage of their unique view.
And confirmed that the lander was safely on the lunar surface at the site that Armstrong had just named Tranquility Base. The next words showed the fear that had just gripped the room. "You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue," meant that everyone in Mission Control had been holding their breath through the final seconds, knowing the fuel was almost gone. It was Duke's way of admitting that the controllers had been so tense they might as well have stopped breathing. "We're breathing again," made the relief plain. It was the team's first safe exhale after what felt like the longest minutes of their lives. In that instant, Duke's southern drawl became part of history. His voice carried both the technical confirmation and the raw emotion of a team that had nearly watched disaster unfold. Yet Duke himself did not receive the recognition that Armstrong, Aldrin, and even Michael Collins received. The public knew his voice, but did not know his face. He was not on the cover of magazines. He did not ride in a ticker tape parade. He did not plant a flag or pose for a photograph on the moon. Instead, He was the invisible astronaut. He had played a crucial role, but he remained in the background. This strange position shaped him deeply. He had lived the moon landing through the tense voices of others, carrying their fear and their triumph as if they were his own, but he was still stuck on Earth. He later admitted that this left him with a restless feeling, a sense of being part of the greatest human leap, but not being allowed to take it himself. He became both a guardian who had protected the mission and an outsider who had only watched through the glass. That dual experience matters now. When Duke finally went to the moon himself, he carried with him the memory of being the voice that steadied Armstrong. No other astronaut has this combined perspective. It makes his testimony different from anyone else's. He is not simply comparing Apollo to history. He is comparing his own two lives, one on Earth guiding others, and one on the moon taking his own steps. In April 1972, Charles Duke finally left his role as the invisible astronaut and set foot on the moon with Apollo 16. And that is when the story began to take a darker turn. Apollo 16, the mission that history tried to forget. At the time, Duke was only 36 years old, the youngest man to walk on the lunar surface. This mission was very different from Apollo 11. Armstrong and Aldrin's goal had been symbolic. They were to land, plant the American flag, and prove that the United States had beaten the Soviet Union in the space race. Apollo 16 had a different mission. It was during this dangerous mission that Duke would gather very shocking details about the moon, which he would later share with the world. The crew, which included Commander John Young, Lunar Module Pilot Charles Duke, and Command Module Pilot Ken Mattingly, aimed for the Descartes Highlands. This was a rough and elevated area of the moon, chosen because scientists believed it would reveal new details about the moon's origins. Unlike the smoother Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 had landed, the Descartes Highlands were rugged, filled with craters, ridges, and boulders. NASA wanted to know how the Descartes Highlands were created. There were two main possibilities. One idea was that they were made by volcanoes long ago. This would mean hot, molten rock had once erupted onto the moon's surface, the same way volcanoes work on Earth. The other idea was that the highlands were formed when giant asteroids slammed into the moon billions of years ago. Those collisions would have thrown up huge amounts of rock and debris that later settled into the highlands we see today. From photographs taken in orbit, it was impossible to tell which idea was correct. Volcanic rocks and impact rocks can look the same from far away. The only way to get a clear answer was to send astronauts there to pick up rocks and bring them back to Earth, where scientists could study them directly. The landing itself was tense.
Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
The space called Orion had to set down on uneven terrain. The surface was not flat or smooth like the area where Apollo 11 had landed. The lunar module had only a small area where its legs could land safely without tipping over. If one leg had touched down on a rock, or if the lander had landed at too steep of an angle, it could have fallen on its side. That would have trapped Duke and Young on the surface, with no way to return to orbit. Duke later explained that even though the Apollo program was in its later stages, the danger was no less real. If anything, the stakes were higher because expectations for scientific return were enormous. Once safely on the ground, Duke and Young faced nearly 71 hours of surface operations. That was almost 3 full days on the moon, longer than most other Apollo crews. Their work was relentless. They drove the lunar roving vehicle, a battery-powered car, across 16 miles of rugged terrain. At times, the rover bounced over craters and rocks, and there was always the risk of a wheel breaking or the vehicle tipping. A mechanical failure would have stranded them far from their lander with little chance of survival. During those 3 days, the crew collected 209 pounds of rock and soil. These samples were more geologically diverse than those retrieved on earlier missions. Some of the rocks were ancient, dating back billions of years, which confirmed that the moon's crust had formed very early in solar system history. Others showed complex chemical compositions that helped prove the highlands were shaped mainly by asteroid impacts, not volcanic eruptions, as many had believed. Even today, scientists are still studying fragments of the material that Duke and Young carried back in their sample bags. The mission also deployed several scientific instruments that had never been used on the Moon before. Gamma-ray and X-ray spectrometers were carried on the rover to measure the chemical fingerprint of the lunar surface.
Perhaps the most visually spectacular aspect of this mission was when the crew took their rover out to sites far beyond where they landed.
These instruments revealed valuable details about the concentrations of iron, titanium, and magnesium, findings that reshaped models of the Moon's interior and showed it was less uniform than once thought. Seismometers were also placed to detect moonquakes, vibrations that revealed the Moon's interior was more rigid and inactive than Earth's, further supporting the view that it was a geologically dead world. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Apollo 16 was the deployment of the first telescope ever placed on another world.
320, bearing 350, and range is 4.3.
This was a far ultraviolet telescope designed to capture wavelengths of light that are blocked by Earth's atmosphere. For the first time in human history, scientists were able to study starlight and the structure of Earth's outer atmosphere directly from the lunar surface without distortion. Despite all of these breakthroughs, Apollo 16 faded into obscurity. The public was already losing interest in the Moon program. Apollo 11 had been the first, Apollo 13 had nearly ended in tragedy, and Apollo 17 would be remembered as the last. Apollo 16, despite its unmatched scientific return, was quietly forgotten. Duke later admitted that this hurt him. He felt that what he and John Young had done was erased by the spectacle of Armstrong's first step and Jim Lovell's desperate survival story.
I'm still breathing and my heart's pounding, and John comes over and looks down and says,
For Duke, the frustration was not only about credit. He believed that ignoring Apollo 16's achievements meant losing sight of what the Apollo program was really about. It was not just about politics or Cold War rivalry. It was about discovery. It was about rewriting what humanity knew about the Moon and, by extension, the Earth itself. But if Apollo 16 was forgotten by history, Duke's memories were not. What he carried back was not just rocks and data. He carried haunting images of the Moon itself, images that no photograph or NASA press release ever revealed, and they were far removed from what the public was told to believe. The blackest sky and the Earthrise lie. When Charles Duke finally stepped out of the lunar module on Apollo 16, he expected the Moon to look much like the training images he had studied for years, a dusty, barren surface with rocks scattered across a gray plain. What shocked him most was not the surface at all, but the sky. On Earth, even at night, the sky has some kind of texture. We see stars, the faint glow of the atmosphere, or even the dim light of the horizon. On the Moon, there was none of that. It was a world stripped of gradients. Duke explained that the sky above was an absolute infinite void. It was not simply dark. It was empty in a way the human eye had never processed before. He later described it as feeling like he was falling into nothing. No camera ever captured what the human eye saw. The cameras flattened the scene, balancing the exposure so that both the surface and the darkness above appeared less extreme. To Duke's eyes, the difference was staggering. Below him, the lunar ground reflected the harsh glare of the sun. It was blindingly bright, almost white. Above him, the sky swallowed everything in a pitch black that seemed endless. Shadows on the ground were so sharp, they looked cut with a knife. The shock grew worse when Duke realized something else.
Some of these small depressions through the upper surface of the soil in about 5 or 6 inches of bay.
Popular culture and NASA's own imagery had convinced people that all astronauts stood on the Moon and stared at Earth rising above the horizon. This image, often called Earthrise, became one of the most iconic symbols of space exploration. Yet from Apollo 16's landing site, Earth was not on the horizon at all. It was directly overhead. Because of the way the lunar module had landed and the design of the space helmet, Duke could not see Earth. He explained that the helmets were designed with a wide visor in front, but were blocked at the top. Astronauts could not look straight upward. If Duke tried, he only saw the opaque side of his helmet. As a result, the most poetic view people believed every astronaut had witnessed, the blue marble of Earth hanging in the void, was never part of his experience. For Duke, this shattered a myth. The postcard image of Earth floating above the moon's barren surface was an illusion built from select photographs and NASA's promotional material. It had nothing to do with what he personally saw. What he experienced instead was a suffocating environment that stripped away the comfort of familiar skies and replaced it with a crushing void. If even the view was an illusion, what about the surface itself? Duke soon realized that standing on the moon was not the liberating experience people imagined. Instead, it felt like being trapped in a world that was harsh, hostile, and suffocating. Trapped in the helmet, the moon as a prison. Charles Duke often said that the spacesuit he wore on the moon was less like a tool and more like a cage. From the outside, the photographs of Apollo astronauts give the impression of strength and grace. They show men striding across the surface, planting flags, and saluting in front of the camera.
So he gives me a big Navy salute. He jumps up about a foot and a half, give me a salute.
To the public, it looked like freedom. Inside the suit, however, the experience was the opposite. The helmet gave Duke a narrow view, which he later compared to looking through a fishbowl. He could see straight ahead, but he could not look up. He could not turn his eyes sideways to catch movement or detail in his periphery. Peripheral vision, which people on Earth rely on for awareness, was completely gone. If he wanted to look at a rock lying to the left or right, he had to twist his entire body in the stiff suit to bring it into view. This turned what should have been simple movements into exhausting tasks. The joints of the suit were thick, pressurized, and resistant. Every time Duke tried to bend, kneel, or turn, he had to fight against the stiffness. Something as basic as grabbing a tool or leaning down to examine a rock became a slow, awkward process. On Earth, humans move smoothly without thinking. On the moon, Duke described it as stumbling in slow motion, always struggling to maintain balance in the 1/6 gravity, while the rigid suit pushed back against every motion. Even sound was limited. On Earth, even in the quietest places, there are always background noises. You might hear the wind moving through trees, distant traffic, or the sound of birds. On the moon, none of that existed. There was no air to carry natural sound. The environment itself was completely silent. Duke explained that the only noises he could hear came from inside his own suit. There was the steady hiss of oxygen being pumped into his helmet, the constant hum of the cooling system that prevented his body from overheating, and the crackling voices from Mission Control in Houston. Those mechanical sounds were reminders that his life depended entirely on the suit. If the oxygen stopped or the cooling system failed, he would have had only minutes to live. Far from making the moon feel vast and inspiring, this isolation made it feel tight and claustrophobic, as though he were sealed off from the world around him and locked inside a fragile bubble of technology. NASA's official images and television broadcasts did not show this reality. The public saw clear photographs of astronauts posing confidently on the surface. What people did not realize was that every one of those pictures was the product of careful positioning and enormous physical effort. Behind the heroic image was an astronaut gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and constantly aware that one mistake could be fatal. Duke later admitted that the reality of moving around the moon was closer to struggling inside a coffin with glass windows than walking as a free explorer. This contrast destroyed the fantasy for Duke. Before leaving Earth, he imagined standing on the moon as an inspiring and liberating moment. Once there, The limitations of the suit reminded him constantly that survival was fragile. And yet, inside this suffocating prison, Duke and his partner achieved science that would change how we understand the moon. But even in the middle of these triumphs, danger was never far away. In fact, Duke would come terrifyingly close to death during one mistake that could have ended the mission instantly: the near-fatal fall. After long hours of demanding work on the lunar surface, there were moments when Charles Duke and John Young tried to lighten the mood. The stress of living in constant danger was enormous, and joking around helped them cope. During one break, they decided to try what Duke later called the Lunar Olympics. The 1/6 gravity of the moon made simple movements, like walking and jumping, feel strange. So they experimented with how high they could leap. Duke crouched down and pushed upward with all his strength, expecting a small hop. Instead, he was launched much higher than he had anticipated. When he came back down, he lost control and fell backward. In that instant, what seemed playful nearly became fatal. On his back was the portable life support system, the backpack that kept him alive. This unit contained oxygen for breathing, water for cooling, a pump to circulate that water through tubes in his suit, and the electrical systems that powered everything. If the backpack had cracked open or broken on impact, Duke would have lost his life support system instantly. There was no backup. He would have had only minutes before suffocating or overheating inside his suit. There was nothing John Young could have done to save him. They were hundreds of thousands of miles away from Earth, and every second of survival depended entirely on that fragile backpack. Duke admitted later, "It was stupid. If that backpack had broken, I'd be dead." He understood that what felt like a joke in the moment was actually reckless. This close call revealed the razor-thin line between life and death on the moon. Every step the astronauts took, every time they bent down to pick up a rock, every time they tried to maneuver the rover, carried the risk of catastrophe. Duke later reflected that even laughter on the moon was filled with fear. He explained that this was the reality that the public never saw. NASA's broadcasts and photographs showed smiling astronauts waving to the camera. They did not show the constant proximity to death that hung over every movement. And this was not the only truth hidden from the public. Beyond the immediate dangers, Duke began to see the moon for what it truly was. The moon is not beautiful. It is terrifying. For most of his life, Charles Duke had seen the moon presented as a place of beauty. Posters and movies made the moon look like a majestic gray landscape, quiet and serene. To Duke, the reality was the opposite. After walking across its surface for 3 days, he concluded, the moon wasn't beautiful in a comfortable way. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. The first thing that stripped away the illusion was the lack of atmosphere. On Earth, the air scatters light, softens the horizon, and creates haze. This makes mountains look distant, and skies fade gently into one another. On the moon, there was none of this. The horizon ended sharply, with no fading or blending. Every ridge and crater appeared unnaturally sharp. There was no gradual transition from light to shadow. Bright areas were overwhelmingly bright, and shadows were pure black. The colors of the moon also added to its harshness. The surface was not silver or pale gray, as many people imagined from photographs. It was closer to a dull charcoal, with a powdery texture that reflected sunlight in a blinding way. Fine dust covered everything. This dust was created by billions of years of tiny meteors, striking the moon and breaking rocks into sharp fragments. On Earth, sand and dust are gradually smoothed by wind, water, and erosion. Over time, grains on Earth become rounded and soft to the touch. On the moon, there is no wind, no rain, and no rivers. Nothing exists to wear down the particles. As a result, lunar dust stayed jagged and sharp, almost like tiny shards of glass. Under Duke's boots, it clung stubbornly, coated his suit, and scratched equipment. Its chemical makeup even included microscopic glass particles formed in past impacts, making it highly abrasive and dangerous if carried inside the spacecraft and inhaled by astronauts.
Spacecraft can't receive messages from the dark side of the moon.
Another feature that unsettled Duke was the way shadows behaved. On Earth, shadows have a range of tones because of scattered light in the atmosphere. On the moon, shadows have no depth. They were absolute black, so dark that if an astronaut stepped into one, his boots seemed to vanish. There was no way to judge how deep a hole was or how steep a slope might be without stepping directly into it. Duke recalled how even simple movements required extreme caution because one wrong step could mean falling or damaging equipment. The horizon itself created an unnatural sense of confinement. On Earth, the horizon is distant because the planet is so large. On the moon, which is much smaller, the horizon seemed to wrap close around him. Duke said it felt like walking inside a bowl, with the edge of the world only a short distance away. Combined with the lack of atmosphere, this gave the landscape an artificial, almost staged appearance. It reinforced the sense that the moon was not a welcoming environment, but a hostile one.
But even the little children here can walk with God. The walk on the moon did not change my life. The walk with Jesus has changed my life.
But the deception went deeper still. Even the scientific results they brought back, data that challenged what scientists thought they knew about the moon, remained half-buried, raising the question of what else was never revealed to the public. What NASA never told us. Apollo 16 made discoveries that should have changed how the world understood the moon. Charles Duke and John Young collected rocks billions of years old, deployed instruments that recorded the moon's chemical fingerprint, and set up the first telescope ever placed on another world. Yet the way those results were handled afterward left Duke deeply frustrated. For him, the mission had delivered answers, but most of those answers never reached the public in a meaningful way. The telescope was the most striking example. It captured ultraviolet light from stars and galaxies that cannot be seen from Earth because our atmosphere blocks those wavelengths. It even recorded new information about Earth's outer atmosphere. At the time, this was historic. It was the first time human beings had used the surface of another world as a platform to study the universe. But outside of scientific journals, almost nothing was said about it. NASA press releases focused on photographs of astronauts driving the rover and standing beside the American flag.
They're barely sinking in. Hey, we can see that. You can't put it too far down in the middle of the...
The telescope data, which should have been front-page news, was left to specialists. The spectrometers told another hidden story. As Duke and Young drove across the highlands, the instruments measured the distribution of elements across the surface. The results showed that titanium, magnesium, and iron were not evenly spread, which overturned earlier assumptions that the moon's surface was simple and uniform. Instead, the data suggested a violent history of asteroid impacts and internal processes that had reshaped the crust over billions of years. These findings complicated the neat story of the moon as a dead body and raised new questions about how it formed. Yet the public never heard that version. NASA highlighted the safe landing and rover journeys, while the chemical evidence that contradicted older theories was quietly filed away. The rock samples were just as important. Among the 209 pounds of material, many confirmed that the Descartes Highlands were shaped primarily by ancient asteroid impacts, not volcanic activity.
Furthermore, these flashes may have important implications for future exploration and colonization of the moon.
This was a direct answer to the central question that had driven the mission. For scientists, it was a breakthrough. For the public, it barely registered. The results were published in technical reports and academic conferences, but they never received the attention of Apollo 11's footprints or Apollo 13's drama. Some of Apollo 16's material is still sitting in storage. Several rock samples remain sealed, waiting for future technology to analyze them. Large parts of the data from the rover instruments were left underused for decades. Budget cuts played a role, but Duke believed there was also a deliberate choice to keep Apollo's public story focused on Cold War triumph rather than messy, complicated science. With time running out for him, Charles Duke admits that humanity has been living with a curated illusion of the moon, and his final warning is meant to shatter that illusion before his voice is lost forever. He warns that as humanity prepares for Artemis and Mars, we must face these harsh realities of the moon. What do you think about Charles Duke's confession? Comment down below.